the overall condition of the group that produces this music is just completely not reflected in the commercial ascent of said music.
George, welcome to Audible.
Thank you.
I'm very excited to chat about your new book, Track Record.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the book is about music, and you write that the music business is a really good example of how capitalism in the world works.
Right.
So why is that?
Music is amazing. Music is boundaryless. Music travels. And music is an amalgam of like all of our experiences. So when you start to delineate these experiences, you start to dive into where these musical influences come from, the conditions under which they emerged, and then the ways that they were commercialized. Yeah, you can get quite a good glimpse into how global capital works, how the production, the labor, the life experience that goes into creating music is alienated from the profit. Yeah, a lot of the time, in fact, every time, the overall condition of the group that produces this music is just completely not reflected in the commercial ascent of said music.
Mm. And you write that Jay-Z is not really a self-made man, that no one can really be a self-made person.
Mm-hmm.
So why, in that particular example, let's take Jay-Z,
Mm-hmm.
would you say that he's not a self-made man?
Well, yeah, no one is really self-made. Jay-Z is not self-made in the sense that he didn't emerge out of nothing. It's become very common to characterize hip-hop as something that started out of nothing, which is a great snapshot of capitalist propaganda. None of these communities emerge from nothing, and their music doesn't emerge from nothing. It emerges from long-running storytelling techniques that become increasingly specific to their context. So what that means is that this community is uniquely responsible for the music it creates. It's not to say that Jay-Z dropped anywhere in the world with the same biology, but just a different context, would still be the most prominent, probably the richest rapper in the world. No, probably not. If he was born in Congo, if he was the same person with the same parentage, even in a different city at that point, and he was born end of 1969, it would be different,
And what did your own time with a record deal teach you about the music industry?
My time in a record deal revealed to me that, as I put it in the book, not all assets are created equal. So the idea of a record deal is that talent needs funding, as everything does. A lot of the time, artists are berated for signing record deals because they are being said to over-rely on an industry, on, white capital, and, this is our thing. But let's be honest, in order to scale anything, it takes investment. So you're bringing your talent and they're bringing the investment, but ultimately the investment, the financial capital, gets the final say. They get control of the budget. Therefore, they get to decide what to amplify and what to mute. And I felt that was part of my education in that record deal.
What were they muting of you?
People often said lazily to me, which is just a truism that pervades a lot of mainstream Black production processes. Audiences are not interested in thoughtful stuff. Conscious stuff isn't as appealing as non-conscious stuff. But I always went to great lengths to try and satisfy what I was reading from the market with what I believed was in the best interests of the consumer, of the community. So I would, for example, make my first EP all about the start of a traumatic family, how a problematic relationship becomes a problematic family structure. And some of my framing was problematic. Some of my work was, I look back on it and think I would approach that slightly differently. However, the intention was to support and to facilitate healing, important conversations about the way we view each other in romantic situations and sexual situations, and how that becomes a brand new life that now is fraught with problems. And I had a whole strategy. I wanted to place this body of work in mother and baby shelters across the country, which I think is I feel like that was a good idea, but it was just ignored for longer than I found acceptable. Yet when I produced what you might call lowest common denominator music, everyone acted like I had reinvented the wheel. Everyone was like, amazed at my genius. And I'm like, oh my God, this is the Emperor's New Clothes.
So you left that music deal and you ended up leaning more into poetry.
Yeah.
But how did the poetry begin? When was your first step into the music becoming poetry?
I always conceptualized our early rap under the era of grime, first wave UK grime music. I conceptualized that as poetry.
Mm-hmm.
We put a lot of effort into making sure our words were as artistic as possible. I found in grime the allowance of what we could talk about restrictive, what we were encouraged again by the market, and again by our peers absorbing these market indicators, these norms that we saw from the mainstream. So my peers would say to me, yeah, man, you can't talk about what I wanted to talk about, my reality, studying, being concerned for my community, trying to forge a path of manhood, masculinity, blackness that was not toxic, was not self-destructive, didn't start from all the negative assumptions about our nature that hip-hop and grime was promoting. But yeah, my peers would be the ones to intervene and be like, hey man, this isn't gonna work.
Mm.
And I was always of the opinion that we don't have enough of a sample to say. Like, who's trying? Who's attempting to allow us to assess their performance?
Mm. And you write about your time at Cambridge University and one moment where a fellow student asked if you'd perform grime and you didn't feel comfortable doing that in that environment. So what was your thought process then when you thought, I don't feel okay with this, what else could I do?
Many people didn't relate to my context. So I was very self-conscious about how that context is presented. And I understood grime music to be quite fast-paced. So if I'm going to be performing high-octane, fast-paced music to an audience that is not familiar with my cultural context, I might end up looking like a caricature. And that frightened me. That made me just say, I'm not going to perform, I'm not going to present my artistic side in Cambridge. And eventually, big up Khalil, my friend that pushed for this. I compromised with him and said, look, I'll perform, but it's not going to be how you remember me performing.
Mm. And there's one thing you wrote in the book about when you were at Cambridge, you became kind of more isolated, more introverted, and that's something that never really fully left you.
Yeah.
Is that something that you still feel now?
Yeah. And again, I find a lot of intersecting influences there. I do think that celebrity it can be an alienating experience, but also I feel that there's something about London in particular, maybe Western Europe, maybe Western society in general. It leads us to form very atomized lives where it's just harder, it's a lot more effort to stay connected. But then also returning to racial capitalism, I found that the further I progress in my career, the harder it is to find people of my ilk, of my walk of life in the professional spaces where I'm spending most of my time. Mm. And all of these things come together to make me a bit of a loner.
Mm. Do you miss that kind of community from school where it's kind of a moment where you're kind of pushed into it?
Yeah, I do miss it. I always think about how different my experience of this country would be if the people I grew up with all had the same access to opportunities as I did and were not now being increasingly, I'll be honest with you, increasingly consumed with the deteriorating mental health implications of poverty, unemployment. Those are the main things. I'll leave crime out of it because crime is not as big of a factor as poverty and unemployment in the disintegration of my community.
Mm. So what things do you do to kind of feel like you are still part of community?
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. Like the main thing, I guess, is paying more attention to my actual family and friends. I hint at this in my transition to podcasting that I write about in the book, where just listening to my nephews a little bit more, being on the ground in Uganda, Unfortunately, in the prison system, it will connect me more directly with the community that I grew up in. The music scene as well, it remains a connector. And a lot of what I'm describing is also juggling the transition into different stages of adulthood. Because the older you get, the less leisure time, the less communal time that you have. So it becomes more important to give of yourself to your loved ones, your friends, and in my case, your audience.
You mentioned Uganda there. You went for a good trip there before you started university. What did that trip and that time in Uganda mean to you?
That time in Uganda allowed me to experience being an African in Africa as a young adult. Really, really nothing like it. In Uganda, I am not black. No one ever dealt with me as a black person. The older I get, the more I realize it also gave me the basics of a third world perspective. There are elements of the global South experience which are quite consistent across what used to identify itself as the third world. I know that's become an awkward phrase, but as I explain in the book, it actually stems from the identification of those emerging from colonization as not necessarily aligning with capitalism or socialism, just being the undecided third estate in French parlance. So looking at the world through that lens allowed me to think more critically about our experience, firstly in Black Britain, then in Britain, then in the West more generally.
Yeah. And so how does the West continue to disrupt African countries long after colonization is supposedly over?
I think it's very important to understand that what we're told about capitalism being an open system of competition in which whoever can solve a problem will organically rise to the top, it's a theory. That's putting it politely. But there is a reality that is at odds with that theory. And that reality is that a lot of wealth, a lot of power has been hoarded over centuries of oppression, centuries of exploitation, centuries of genocide, pushing populations around in service of capital, in service of production, at the behest of a few people, a shockingly small minority of the world gets to decide how generations are going to live for centuries. So the control of those processes, the control of who produces what, at what cost, that is tightly owned. And it's in that way that practically a handful of Western capitalists, they're able to influence trade policy, they're able to influence migration policy, the movement of not just people, but capital. All of these things ultimately influence how a so-called democracy in the global South will pan out.
And in this book, you look at, the broader context. You're looking at things globally. You're also looking at things personally. And there's a conflict that you write that you have, which is the kind of making those something's better than nothing changes that work within the system versus making radical changes that will change the system or work outside the system.
Yeah.
How are you doing with kind of balancing those two things and deciding where to put your energy?
I think a lot of it is about ego. It's an ego battle. It hurts to think of yourself as someone who is part of something problematic, or to think of yourself as someone who is dependent on inequality, dependent on injustice. In order for us to continue to wear nice clothes and to have trinkets and conveniences in this world, we rely on the continued extraction of resources in parts of the world that are under the yoke of imperialism, like immensely poor, impoverished, I should say, not poor, made to live in conditions of poverty. We don't realize how much of our security in the West is tied up. And when I say security, I mean, for want of a better word, I think our normalcy, our sense that everything is ticking along fine, is predicated on the ongoing violation, degradation. I don't like the word dehumanization because it wrongly implies that any group of humans has the ability to make another group less human. All you can do is delude yourself that this other group's less human. So you kind of dehumanize yourself, I guess. A lot of what we experience is based on that. And coming to terms with that is the big challenge. For those of us who were, not born in a context in which this information is available before, we're old enough to just read it for ourselves and to watch the patterns of the world. So we tend to find out about this stuff as adults, by which time we are not trained in revolution, we're not trained in community organizing and political organizing. So we end up conflicted, deeply conflicted about our role in the world, as am I. Yeah, I think those of us in that position have to do two things. We have to continue to survive, and we have to find ways of surviving that are less and less harmful to the rest of the world. That's a challenge.
And what would you say, if we're talking radical solutions, what do radical solutions look like?
People talk a lot about dismantling capitalism. I guess that's the most radical solution. Many people struggle with that wording because they get the image of something quick and intense and violent happening, but there can be a gradual movement towards something else. I think it will take a long time of ensuring that a larger proportion of the world understands what capitalism is, how it started, and how it's going.
Yeah. And to bring it back to the music side of it, you write about Tupac and how he is a rare example of Black radicalism and Black music coming together. Do you think that there is a space in the current music industry for more people like him to emerge?
I think the music industry is inherently anti that. So Tupac was successfully derailed, was drawn into conflict, and there is, significant reason to believe that there was state collusion to intervene in his success and to potentially end his life. That seems supported by the ongoing inability to pinpoint exactly what happened in the most famous strip in the world, the Vegas Strip, on the night of his death. So yeah, Tupac is a kind of a flagship artist when it comes to radicalism and revolutionary sentiment in rap music. But you just won't hear the rest. There are a lot of radical artists. I was explaining this point to someone about Kendrick Lamar the other day. I don't perceive Kendrick as particularly radical at all. But someone was saying that, he's one of one. And I was trying to say that I believe that to be a manufactured narrative. I know loads of rappers and poets who are very talented, whose politics is much clearer than mine, and who are deeply rooted and committed to their community. But the mainstream will never know them because, as I said at the start, the industry is against that kind of politics. So, the expansion of control, again, the expansion of control to everyday people in terms of Black music with regards to what we create, how we address our problems, how we talk about ourselves, that has to be taken away from the music industry in order for radical politics to reach its potential.
Well, Georgia, it's been such a pleasure to chat. There's a million things I could pick up from the book to chat to you all day, but I will leave it there and people can go and have a listen.
Listen, man, thank you very much for a very fair conversation. I didn't know we were talking like this on such a public platform, but I appreciate it.
Thank you.